So I think now we're in a good place to start adding materials, and we're going to do it through the VRAY material editor. And one way we're going to go about this is just create a different material for each layer. Since we've grouped all the objects by layers, we don't have to worry about individually applying the material. So I'm just going to name them according to the layers and just use some bitmaps and textures and throw them on. Um, and we're going to use a bump map for the pavers. And we'll get into more detail about what those are and how we can use them in future videos. The VRAY material editor is pretty straightforward. There's a few menus and interfaces that are not very intuitive, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy to use. Okay, and then after we've done the materials, we can start setting up the environment variables. In this case, we're going with an outdoor environment, so it's going to be pretty straightforward. I always turn the environment skylight down, this one right here. Set it to something very low, kind of blue hue for the color of the sky that you want to use. You're not going to really see it emphasized very strongly in the render, but it adds an additional layer. And then tinker with the sun, give it some values, orientation, angle, things like that. I usually increase the subdivisions for improving the quality, but you don't have to. Now, the size is important. This is something that took me a while to figure out, but when I started tinkering with VRAY, at first I would get these really hard shadows. See what's going on here? The trees look like they're just a few feet away from some nuclear explosion. Um, and that's not very realistic. So the way to work around that is to actually increase the size of the sun. So in the sun toolbar, you'll see a checkbox or a drop down for typing in a number, and you can put in any range you want. The default is 1, and if it's 1, you get these really hard shadows. The bigger the number, the softer the shadows will come out. And I'll get to that in a second. So when we're applying the textures, for example, in this case, the pavers, you noticed I had it repeat itself. That's because the texture itself, even though it is a repeating pattern, it might not be scaled proportionally. You have to tinker with this until you get it right. In this case, I'm using a straightforward paver pattern that I found online. And keep track of what you set for those repeat settings there. So the U and the V, that just indicates how many times it's going to repeat itself over the surface. And think of it, it's going to just squeeze itself into there. So if you make it repeat itself 5 times, then you get 5 instances of that, but it'll be shrunk to fit into the surface. So if you set it to repeat at a certain rate for the straight direct application, and then you come back and you want to apply a bump map or a displacement map, which we'll get into later, you want to make sure that the repeat settings are the same so that when you insert the displacement, it's lining up with its actual. Don't worry if this doesn't make sense to you right now. Just something to keep track of. Here's the paving pattern we're using. and I'm going to make a copy, turn the colors down, um, and set this up for a displacement. Displacement maps are preferably black and white, and that's how the render calculates the ranges and the values for the displacement. So the dark areas will have one type of depth, and the lighter it is, it will have a different range. Think of it as a z value that's increasing or changing. So now we're going to go back in, turn on the bump. So in this case, we're doing a bump map, not a displacement map. They're very similar, but they have different outputs. Repeat settings are the same, and we're going to choose the bitmap that we just created for the bump map, which is just essentially a copy of the um, original texture. We turn it black and white, push the levels a little bit, so it's got more emphasis, and then we save the copy. Now we're adding the copy as a bump. So when I apply it to that material, it's going to render with the original texture and an overlay of the bump map. So that will give it some more depth and realism. Now these are neat things to have. They're not critical or necessary. They just add another layer to your final render, but it's not super critical. So now I'm going through all the materials we created and named, and I'm going to apply some textures and bitmaps to each one accordingly. Looks like I use a texture of a watercolor or some kind of grunge material for the tree trunks. It doesn't matter because in Photoshop we're going to overlay realistic trees. Remember, we're using the trees for shadow calculations. Making final adjustments to the sun. And now, a very important tool that I use all the time, and you should get in the habit of using this. Almost all 3D applications have this feature, and it's essentially a thumbnail saver or a screenshot saver, or it saves your view. In this case, in Rhino, it's called named views, and it captures the angle and perspective view of your current viewport and saves it. So you can save that shot and then move around your model to do further edits and tinker a little bit with it, and then come back to your original view that you saved for the render. So now I'm going through the model and I'm looking at different perspectives and angles to create these thumbnails or key shots. And what I'm going to do from this is do some multiple renders, quick studies, and then pick the best one that fits the objectives, what we're trying to get through. These trees are a little too out of scale. So I've saved 4 views, and I can quickly switch between them to pick the one I want. And those will always be there. So if the client wants a demo from a different view, I can always come back and start over. Oh, looks like I forgot to add the seat wall we had in the back. We're going to model that real quick. Alright, so I skipped ahead and I've added some houses in the background, some structures, just to give this side a little bit more context. And we're going to use that as a backdrop in our render. This is a sample of the VRAY render buffer, essentially what it spits out and what we take to Photoshop. So we're ready to move on to the next step now.